And there seems to be the immunity issue is one that was dealt with earlier this week unanimously. That's probably not going to come to the high court for some time. But here we are today, Colorado. And there's a political argument here where some have said, including on our earlier today, that this would be actually a bad thing if Donald Trump were taken off the ballot, because it would fuel his argument that the deep state is out to get him. It would fuel his sense of grievance. It would rile up his supporters. Maybe we'd even have violence. But almost to a person, every legal expert we've talked to says it's pretty clear that Trump did what he's accused of doing, that he violated the 14th Amendment and therefore fomented an insurrection and shouldn't be allowed to be on the ballot. But it's hard to imagine the court going there. What do you think?
I mean, my view is a little bit in between those, in the sense that I'm not a lawyer, but I think the legal case that he's in violation of these things is very strong. But I am sympathetic to the view that this is the wrong way to beat Trump for a couple reasons. Number one, you and I were just talking about this in the hallway. I think there has been since 2015 a fantasy of getting rid of Trump through the kind of investigations and inquests and criminal proceedings and this and that. And it is now 9 years on, and none of those have actually shown the ability to protect American democracy from him. So 9 years is a pretty long time to wait for our institutions to save us. They may not save us just as a matter of timing. But secondly, we should let these legal things play out. But I think there is a distracting quality to the folk. We turn on the news, this channel, any channel, we're always talking about these investigations. And what we're not talking about is organizing that's happening in communities to actually try to build a coalition to defeat American fascist offerings, to defeat the big lie that you wrote about. So I think we are kind of lulled into like being like passive consumers of legal cases, winding on about which, over which we have no control, instead of doing the thing over which we have immense control. Only half of us vote in this country. There's a whole other half of people who could be organized into voting, into actually building a movement to put American fascism in its proper place, which is the dustbin of history. And every moment that we are kind of obsessing and fixating over, will the courts come for him, we're not talking about fixing this the old-fashioned way, which is beating it at the ballot box.
Yeah. Well, and I think you make a great point. I hear and understand the concern, Anand, that you're sending us here. And at the same time, when the first indictment came down, everyone was like, this is the wrong way to beat Trump, the Stormy Daniels, this is the wrong case to start with. And then I think it was documents, and then I think it was stolen elections, and then I think there were civil suits. And then I think, my God, every case doesn't feel like the right way to beat Trump. But at some point, we are a nation of laws. And this former president has run through so many stop signs, both politically and, one could argue, legally. And I'm only going to talk about the things that he either has openly done, like defame a woman's character when a judge has already ruled that he defames a woman's character, and he continues to defame her character when told not to. Those are obvious, blatant problems. And also massive fraud that he's been found liable for. Right now, we're just talking about how many hundreds of millions of dollars he might have to pay for the fraud he committed, and stolen documents, possibly even nuclear secrets, that he claims are his documents. And he can have them and nobody else can have them. And he has them sitting in Mar-a-Lago. These are things he admits to, that he's indicted for or charged with in civil court. And he runs through stop signs, and the system doesn't seem to hold him back. So some people might say, at least Jen Psaki, that at some point before we lose our democracy, there has to be a consequence for actions that if anybody else in this country committed, they would be hauled off either politically or to jail legally.
Yeah, I mean, Mika, with all due respect to Anand, I'm in a very completely different place on this. I would say that it's important to remember the origin of the 14th Amendment. And Sherrilyn Ifill and others actually wrote a brief where they really outlined this as a reminder that it was to protect the voices of those who were often suppressed, including the African-American community. It's important to remember the history here. The other thing I would say is that it's important to talk about these cases because it's important to remind voters out there in the country what Donald Trump tried to do, which was to suppress exactly those kind of voters. And when Ari said, which is a very interesting and important legal point, and I am not a lawyer either, that this is unprecedented, it's also important to remind people that his actions were unprecedented. So the job of any legal system, the judicial system, is actually not to contemplate the politics. Not that anyone here is suggesting that. It's to ignore that. It's to put blinders on, and it's to apply the law. And here, if you look at Donald Trump's argument and the argument that they outlined in their briefing, what they're arguing is that the insurrection didn't even happen, that he didn't participate in it, that it was 3 hours long and not that many people were armed, and therefore it didn't happen. That's ludicrous on its face. The other thing they argue is that he was not an officer of the court. That's a big part of their, of the United States. That's a big part of their argument, suggesting that as president you're not. So I think it's essential we talk about this. We're all tired of talking about all the intricacies of legal cases. All of us are. But it's so important to remind people of what happened, what's at stake, and that's what will help motivate people in part to organize.
I just want to, that's a great point, and I want to be very, very clear. I'm not saying these cases are not important. They're incredibly important. But there are a small number of people who need to think and work on these cases in the legal system, and most of us do not have power over what happens in these court cases, rightfully. The point I'm making is that I'm talking about just average people watching this, because I experience this when I go out and talk to people. Probably a very large fraction of our viewers, I think, invest a ton of their emotional energy in their despair about Trumpism, focused on the cases instead of on what they can do in their communities to build a bigger, better, overwhelming movement to crush American fascism. He has definitely done things that would send him to jail for the rest of his life if there's any justice in this country, and lose every dollar he has, if he even has that much. But I'm not talking about whether this should happen or not. I'm talking about our attention, regular people's attention, and what I perceive to be a real deficit around actually movement building for the pro-democracy cause. Everyone is mad and angry, and then you actually ask people, what are you doing? How many hours a week are you marching? When was the last time you saw 1 million people in the streets in this country about this? The answers start to get a little bit sad.
I'm not at all. I'm actually saying what you think I'm saying, which is that I do think we should be talking about this. I've done 3 presidential campaigns and many others. I can tell you that a lot of what people need to understand is also what he's capable of. It's not the only thing people should be talking about. Obviously, abortion rights, different approaches to the economy, the fact that the Republican Party wants the Washington dysfunction, all important. But I also think explaining and talking about what's at stake here and what these cases, what the threat is that these cases present in terms of what Donald Trump is capable of doing to our democracy is essentially important. And I think we can't underestimate how much people care about that, too. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think it shouldn't monopolize our focus.